Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual seminar series organized by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I am Dr. Madhu, the host for today's panel and an affiliate researcher with the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I'm also a senior advisor at the Wildlife Conservation Society and an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Biological Sciences at NUS. Before I begin, I would like to announce some housekeeping details. Please keep your microphones muted to prevent audio interference. Please note that this session is recorded and will be posted on YouTube later. A little bit about the center. The NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions is newly established this year. It aims to empower public and private sector leaders in Singapore and Asia to respond appropriately and decisively to climate change. Ultimately, this is for achieving a carbon neutral economy and stable global climate. The center has two key mandates. The first is to build the evidence base on climate science for informing policy, strategy, and action. The second mandate is to build capacity in academic, government, and corporate sector leaders. About the seminar itself, the theme for the seminar is climate change and biodiversity. Humanity faces two massive, urgent, and interconnected emergencies: biodiversity loss and climate change. There is growing awareness that nature-based solutions can mitigate climate change and buffer its impacts. Today, we have a panel of conservation practitioners and researchers to discuss why conserving biodiversity is an important climate action. We will examine the science and policy linkages before delving into how urbanized cities such as Singapore can make contributions to biodiversity and climate targets through nature-based solutions. More importantly, we will also review implementation challenges and analyze emerging opportunities with the private sector. We have with us Dr. Kang and Ms. Kavita Prakash Mani. We will have a 20-minute discussion at the end of the session. If you have any questions for our panelists during the event, please submit them to Poll Everywhere at the link that will be provided to you. You can upvote questions from others there as well. The link is also posted in the chat box. So I will provide the first presentation, which is aimed at setting the context for our discussion today. So the potential for biodiversity as a solution to climate change is a significant opportunity to pursue strategies that can have positive outcomes for both biodiversity and climate change. So where are the linkages and what are some of the main considerations for this relationship? Humanity, as we know, has had an enormous impact on the planet. Roughly 60% of all land on Earth is under moderate or intense human pressure. This has resulted in significant declines in biodiversity in terms of species extinctions and the degradation of natural ecosystems. There is consensus among scientists that climate change is likely to become one of the most significant drivers of biodiversity loss by the end of the century. The potential to protect, restore, and use ecosystems as tools to tackle climate change has gained increasing traction under the broad, overarching framework of nature-based solution. This approach recognizes that ecosystems provide a wide range of ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration, regulating local climate, stabilizing shorelines, protecting coastlines, etc., that directly linked to climate change mitigation. Ecosystem services such as food, raw materials, fresh water, etc., are essential for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Ultimately, all these ecosystem services contribute to human well-being. Existing science provides a solid basis for immediately prioritizing nature-climate solutions as a cost-effective way for climate mitigation within the next decade, a terrestrial ecosystem opportunity that has not been fully recognized by prior roadmaps for decarbonization. So as you can see here, Griscom et al. Modeled the climate mitigation potential of 20 natural pathways across forests, agriculture, grasslands, wetlands, looking at reforestation, restoration, and impacts of avoided conversion. They also mapped ecosystem service benefits linked with each pathway, as indicated by the colored bars for biodiversity, water filtration, etc. Nature climate solutions can provide over 1/3 of the cost-effective climate mitigation needed between now and 2030 to stabilize warming to below 2 degrees centigrade. So alongside aggressive fossil fuel emission reductions, nature climate solutions offer a powerful set of options for nations to deliver on the Paris Climate Agreement while improving soil productivity, cleaning our air and water, and maintaining biodiversity. So there has been a lot of progress on development of the concept of nature-based solutions. So as you can see in this slide, there is a definition, a formal definition provided by the IUCN, which emphasizes the biodiversity benefits of nature-based solutions. And the standard is based on a user-friendly framework for the verification, design, and scaling up of nature-based solutions. 8 criteria that make up the IUCN global standard are all interconnected. The first criterion relates to societal challenges, which means that nature-based solutions clearly have to address a societal challenge, clarifying that nature-based solutions is not just for climate, but for other societal challenges. Second, the design of nature-based solutions is influenced by scale. The third criterion relates to biodiversity. Nature-based solutions have to result in a net gain to biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. Therefore, nature-based solutions design and implementation must avoid undermining the integrity of the system and instead proactively seek to enhance the functionality and connectivity of the ecosystem. Other criteria include economic feasibility or economic viability, so the cost effectiveness of nature-based solutions, criteria on governance, making sure that the processes are inclusive, transparent. The sixth criteria relates to equitable balance and trade in terms of trade-offs between the achievement of the primary goal of these solutions and the continued provision of multiple benefits. Criterion 7 relates to regular monitoring and evaluation of the intervention. And the final criterion 8 relates to sustainability and mainstreaming. Further, there has been a bit of progress on developing a typology in terms of trying to differentiate nature-based solutions on the basis of the level of ecosystem transformation and the level of ecological complexity. So the first type of nature-based solutions consists of no or minimal interventions of ecosystems. So we look at the leftmost, the dark green oval that you see on the graph. These link to trying to protect and enhance services from natural ecosystems, such as trying to create protected areas, terrestrial or marine protected areas. The second category relate to managed or agricultural landscapes, such as restored forests, where there's some level of manipulation. And the third category relates to high levels of ecosystem transformation, intensive management, and includes category of solutions that such as greening buildings or artificial ecosystems. So how do monocultures fit into all of this? Single species, low biodiversity monocultures are problematic for key reasons. While they contribute toward rapid carbon sequestration, their vulnerability to disease and climate extremes means that they have very low potential for carbon storage in the long term. So for forests to sequester carbon in the long term, they must be able to resist, recover, or adapt to changes. Biodiversity enhances the functional resilience of ecosystems, which is also influenced by connectivity and structural heterogeneity. Ecosystems with high ecological integrity, such as intact forests, have extremely high values as carbon sinks. They're also very high in biodiversity, and hence essential nature-based solutions to climate change. As this graph shows, it's not just climate and biodiversity benefits that intact ecosystems and intact forests have, but they have a host of other benefits and values. There are high-resolution maps that tell us how we can protect these intact forests. So only 12% of the global intact forest landscape area is protected. And protecting the remaining intact forest would be a win, not just for biodiversity, but for climate as well. But there are challenges. Intact forests, for example, are not widely recognized as carbon sinks, and incentivizing their protection would require or would depend on how the global climate finance architecture is structured. Similarly, there are priorities that have been identified in terms of where to invest for restoration. So Strasberg et al. Recently published this paper where they show that restoring 30% of the world's ecosystem in certain priority areas could stave off more than 70% of projected extinctions and also have a huge carbon impact. So in terms of the policy context, it's not bad. Nature-based solutions are referred to in one form or another in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, in the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. They're considered to be catalysts for achieving some of the targets in the 2030 UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, and they're relevant to the bond challenge, which links to forest restoration. So all in all, not a bad start for nature-based solutions within the global policy context. But the devil, as always, is in the details. So there are certain barriers to implementation, and it's really early days for nature-based solutions. So one of the key considerations are the need to understand more about their effectiveness in some of the impacts that they're meant to address, their effectiveness geographically across different income groups and also across different ecosystems. So we definitely need to build up the evidence base for this. And this is just starting to happen, as we see in this study by Chaucer et al., which has been published quite recently. So finally, as I said, I think the context for nature-based solutions is quite early. It's early days, and we can broadly think about 4 areas of priorities. The first, if we look at research, there's need for more research on impacts of interventions across diverse ecosystems. So forests have got a huge amount of science and policy attention. We've got to be thinking about other ecosystems, such as grasslands, coastal ecosystems, freshwater wetlands, etc. We've got to be thinking across larger scales. And we've got to look into the cost effectiveness of nature-based solutions compared to alternatives. It would be good to reduce uncertainty of nature climate solution mitigation estimates. There's a fair amount of uncertainty, and more research is needed to reduce that. And also to understand more about the resilience to climate change of these solutions. Further research could help towards the development of indicators and metrics for the socio-ecological effectiveness of NCS interventions. On the policy front, while the linkages between biodiversity and climate change and other threats are becoming more and more clear or have been known, the policy development process has been largely separate. So there's need to enhance the prominence of nature climate solutions and biodiversity in nationally determined contributions, which are commitments made by countries towards the Paris Agreement. In particular, it's important to include more specific, measurable, and robust targets in these NDCs and national implementation plans. On the governance side, getting the governance right is obviously very important. Nature-based solutions are implemented across large landscapes and seascapes, crossing jurisdictional boundaries and involving multiple players. And there needs to be coordination across these many different jurisdictions, and lack of policy coherence sometimes across landscapes can lead to trade-offs and conflicts. And finally, probably one of the most important considerations, which is finance. The lack of sufficient financing is recognized as a major barrier to implementation of nature-based solutions or nature climate solutions. There's need to mobilize greater funding because most of the countries that have made commitments towards the Paris Agreement have made these commitments conditional on financing. So we need to enhance and mobilize more financing in order to get more effective action on the ground. But there are also challenges associated with the current climate finance architecture and the efficacy of the carbon trading mechanisms, which also have to be addressed for biodiversity to be an effective climate solution. So that's just a quick run through of the status of the nature-based solutions as a climate strategy. And I'm going to invite, So I'm going to invite Dr. Ko to be the next speaker. She is a research coordinator and assistant director of the NTU Smithsonian Partnership at the Nanyang Technological University. Her research focuses on tropical trees, forest dynamics, carbon stock, and ecology, especially in the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and the McRitchie Reservoir. Dr. Goh also chairs the butterfly and insect group at the Nature Society in Singapore. Dr. Goh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. So I want to first give a broad introduction to Singapore's position within Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a globally recognized biodiversity hotspot. So over the past hundreds of thousands of years, sea levels have risen and fallen, and land has been exposed and submerged. The white area in the map here shows land area about 17,000 years ago. And so the whole of Southeast Asia used to be connected by land. So these past events have been instrumental in many speciation events for plants and animals. And Singapore sits almost right in the middle of this very diverse region. Fast forward to today, if we look at Southeast Asia, you will find that all of the countries here are classified as developing countries, except Singapore. And deforestation rates here are very high. So within 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, Southeast Asia lost 1.6 million hectares of forests per year. This is the famous figure from Sodhi et al. 2004. So it is basically taking Singapore's extinction rates and projecting them on the rest of Southeast Asia, assuming that Singapore is the worst case scenario for biodiversity. So the question is, will these other Southeast Asian countries follow in Singapore's footsteps in their development process? So Singapore is one of the world's top 15 oil and trading refinery hubs, and it's ranked 27th in per capita emissions. And then I checked the emissions from just consumption. Singapore actually ranked 5th in 2016. So even though Singapore contributes only 0.11% of global emissions, on a per capita basis, our emissions are very high, no matter what index you use. But we are also ranked 7th in per capita income. So we can definitely do more for this climate crisis. So here's an example from a household perspective, looking at carbon footprint per household across the whole country. And Singapore's footprint is more than double the world average. Singapore's latest national target is that by 2030, we will have peak emissions at 65 megatons CO2 equivalent. So this is already actually an improvement from the previous published intended NDC, or nationally determined contribution, which were previously pegged to the national GDP. But still, is this enough? I want to draw your attention to these two blue arrows on the graph. So these are Singapore's targets for this year and for 2030. So the black line turning blue is Singapore's emissions over the years. So you can see that, we pretty much fulfill our targets without doing too much. So even though our total emissions is a small proportion of global emissions, we're not really doing enough going by the Paris Agreement standards. So this is a table from Singapore's latest report to the UNFCCC showing Singapore's emissions. Emissions from energy consumption is way higher than all the other categories, which is not surprising. But what I will cover today, which concerns biodiversity, is the land use change and forestry category, abbreviated as LULUCF. As you can see, if you only consider emissions, the land use category contributes only a very small proportion of total emissions from Singapore. So to set the context for Singapore, almost all the land in Singapore is owned and planned by the Singapore government, specifically the Urban Redevelopment Authority, or URA. So there is always a concept plan, which is a plan that sets a 50-year direction, and a shorter term master plan, which determines the land use for the next 10 to 15 years. So this is a list of major campaigns and marketing slogans that have been used over the years. So Singapore set out trying to be a garden in the early years, and only recently the slogan changed to city in nature. So I think everybody would agree that we have actually succeeded in the transformation to a garden from a slum in the 1960s. But according to this Prof. Schopfer, there is a big difference between garden and nature. And recently, there has been more policies to bring back a more naturalistic look to Singapore. For example, with nature ways and with multi-tiered street planting to try to mimic the look of a forest. There's also been a push for more skyrise greenery. And more recently, last year, there was the Forest Restoration Action Plan and the 1 Million Trees Program. And these are the only two programs that involve our nature reserves and nature parks. But in land-scarce Singapore, how much room is there for nature-based solutions? So this map shows the major terrestrial habitats in Singapore that have very high biodiversity. And not surprisingly, they are also the greenest patches of land that we have. So how do these biodiversity hotspots in Singapore compare with each other? In Bukit Timah, where we do our research, you'll find the biggest patch of primary forests in Singapore. We find 354 tree species in only 2 hectares of forest. In the adjacent secondary forest, there are about 150 species. So the other forest sites here shown in the table are all secondary forests in their various species richness. If you look at the last column, which is the number of nationally critically endangered species, not surprisingly, you will find many such species in Bukit Timah. But some of these secondary forests are not too far behind. And if these secondary forests were given enough time without any disturbances, then they could possibly eventually attain a diversity that's similar to the Bukit Timah secondary forest or even primary forest. But some of these forests are actually not protected, meaning that they don't come under the management of the National Parks Board or NParks. They could come under the Singapore Land Authority or SLA, which holds these forest lands until a decision has been made on what to do with them. And those decisions are guided by the URA master plan. So I'm going to show some good news first. This is a press release from NParks showing all the nature parks that are officially launched or awaiting launch. And in total, there will be about 500 hectares of new parks. And this is the bad news. So between 2007 and 2012, only a 5-year span, 2,600 hectares of young secondary forests had been removed for various development projects in Singapore. And if the URA Master Plan 2014 is followed through, then a total of 4,700 hectares of young secondary forests will potentially be removed by 2030. And as I mentioned before, these young secondary forests are usually not managed by the National Parks Board, because the URA, the HDB or the Housing Development Board, and the NParks, they all come under one ministry, which is the Ministry of National Development. And so to avoid giving out conflicting information and policies between these different government agencies, which have different agenda, each parcel of land in Singapore is clearly demarcated and assigned to one government agency only. So back to emissions, this table is also from the report to UNFCCC. This is specifically for the LULUCF sector, and I want to highlight the forest land category, which is the only category with negative values, meaning that forest has been removed. And these figures actually agree with the previous slide. So Singapore is losing forests. And what does this mean for biodiversity? So now I show this same table again, and I highlight the first two recent nature-based policies, which are the nature ways and the multi-tiered street planting and the skyrise greenery. So I asked the question, can nature ways and skyrise greenery replace forests? So this is a figure from Kwek Yen's paper showing bird and butterfly diversity on different types of landscapes in Singapore. You can see clearly for both birds and butterflies, birds is the graph on the left, butterflies on the right. The high natural greenery, which would include secondary forests, has significantly higher diversity than the managed greenery, which would include the nature ways. And I want to draw your attention to the line above the graph of the species counts. This survey had about 20,000 bird counts and about 6,000 butterfly counts. And the total species counts are 136 for birds and 106 for butterflies. So just keep these numbers in mind. And I'm going to show the next slide. This is a figure from a paper by James, showing results from also bird and butterfly survey on rooftop gardens in Singapore. So you can see from this graph that rooftop gardens, they're good for bringing in some greenery to an otherwise gray and hot landscape on the top of buildings. But for biodiversity, they support mostly the already common species for both birds and for butterflies. And you compare the species counts again, you'll see that this is not an artifact of a smaller sampling effort, because the counts of birds and the counts of butterfly numbers are comparable, but the species richness is half or less than half for birds. So to summarize my presentation, I hope I made it clear that it is natural habitats and not manicured habitats that are important for biodiversity. The land use category in Singapore, although it's a small contributor to total carbon sink and emissions, it is an important one for biodiversity. So all the forests lost in Singapore that happened in the last 2 decades, they happened as individual development projects, and they are usually reported as individual news pieces. So the forest loss is usually not reported, or if it's reported, there'll always be a statement saying that Singapore needs to have a balanced development plan to remain competitive or for our social needs. So some potential land use conflicts in Singapore are usually mitigated at the ministry level, even before they come down to the individual government agencies. But can land use in Singapore be optimized even further to avoid having to cut down these unprotected secondary forests? I think we can do more for these unprotected secondary forests. So the 10-year tree planting plans, it's a good move, but the choices of tree species and the planting locations has to be strategic to maximize the benefits for biodiversity. And finally, what can Singapore do for biodiversity is to really look at our ecological footprint. What is Singapore's impact on the regional landscape through our trade and our imports with our neighbors? And I believe this is what the next speaker, Ms. Kavita, will be covering.
Thank you very much.
Oh, so sorry, I had one more slide to add. So these are two recent news articles about Singapore tapping on the region for our energy needs. So the first one is the electricity import from Malaysia. We stated that we prefer renewable energy, but it doesn't seem like we have a choice actually. The other one is tapping electricity from Australia. So this is a solar farm. It will be the biggest in the world. It will be visible from space. And it will be built at this remote cattle station in the Northern Territory of Australia. So I think this is good news, but I would also like to read more about how this solar farm could potentially impact the local ecosystem in Australia before I make a judgment on how good this plan really is. So that's the end of my talk, and I pass the time back to Dr. Rao. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko, for that fantastic presentation. Our final speaker for today is Ms. Prakash Mani. Ms. Kavita Prakash Mani was most recently the Global Conservation Director at WWF. She is currently in the process of developing a collaborative platform on nature-based solutions for climate and other ecosystem services together with NGOs in Asia to meet the growing demand from companies and the public sector. She's also setting up a new conservation fund in Singapore. Ms. Prakash Mani, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madhu. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be talking to you about nature-based solutions, and especially how it is of relevance to the private sector, to the companies and corporations, and how we can actually get more impact, both to mitigate and adapt to climate, but also have much more biodiversity and conservation of our natural habitats as a consequence. So I won't repeat what you've heard from the previous two speakers. As has been explained, nature-based solutions can help us with a number of societal and environmental problems that can be everywhere from climate mitigation and adaptation to fresh water, to clean air, to food, to healthcare. But what are the different approaches that you can use to get to those human and biodiversity benefits around eco-based solutions, which would be around protection, which would be about management of infrastructure, management of supply chains of companies, but also restoration. So we're really looking at a whole host of activities that can fall under nature-based solutions to have those people and planet benefits that we've been talking about. In that context, really looking at a subset of saying what are nature-based solutions for climate, particularly, so keeping aside for a bit the impact that we can have on biodiversity more strongly. So if we were to look at protecting, restoring, and managing the habitats around the world, which include forests, grasslands, wetlands, mangroves, mangrove soil, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, those would be the kind of solutions we're looking at. And these ecosystems are very able to absorb and store carbon on their own. So they can take carbon out of the atmosphere and help mitigate climate change. In fact, they can provide about a third of the carbon emissions that are required to get to our goal of 1.5 degrees change by 2030. So just the numbers to keep in mind is that 30% of climate solution can come from nature-based solutions. We can take out about 10 to 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year through climate-based solutions. However, only 3% of climate finance currently is going into nature-based solutions. A lot of it is going into renewable energy or transportation or other means of mitigating climate through different kind of solutions. So we see the need to invest in nature-based solutions for climate, but the investment we're actually making is very small. In that context, if we start looking at saying what's the role that businesses could play, because we need to get more investment into nature-based solutions, so why would companies bother at all? And the main point here is that even if companies reduce their emissions. So if you're looking at from a corporate perspective, the aim that companies should be net zero in their carbon emissions, like we need them to halve their emissions every 10 years if we need to get to the Paris Agreement, whether it's through their own operations, whether it's through the products and use that they have, whether it's through the supply chain impacts that they have, or the actual production of the goods and services that they have through the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. If companies take as much as they can in terms of their efficiency of energy use or their reduction, we still need a certain amount of carbon emissions to be offset. There will still be some level of carbon emissions that the companies have, and that needs to be offset somehow or the other. So that's where you have a gap, and you can use nature-based solutions. For nature, of course, these projects can really help protect the habitats, can avoid land degradation, can regenerate nature, whether it's forests or whether it's wetlands, peatlands, grasslands, marine ecosystems. And of course, that we can then go back into restoration, which is a long-term and highly capital-intensive endeavor, but also sustainable use. We do need our landscapes, and Madhu was talking about mixed landscapes of producing our food, but also protecting our habitat. So we can get a lot more investment into nature and nature-based solutions. And if you start looking at what companies are doing, and I'll just walk us through a few examples, you take Apple. Apple has committed to 100% carbon neutrality through its supply chain and for its products by 2030. But they are very clear that they will still need carbon removal through nature-based solutions to get there to that target that they have set. So they are looking at restoration and protection of forests. They will be working with a number of big NGOs such as Conservation International or WWF. The kind of investments they are looking at are very geared towards the kind of conservation outcomes we want. So whether it's vital mangrove ecosystems in Colombia, or it's the degraded grasslands and the savannas in Kenya, or it's looking at working with communities to then protect coastlines. They are really looking at very core conservation outcomes that are being defined by big NGOs like WWF and CI and the Conservation Fund to ensure that conservation, climate, and nature is brought together. So for example, 1 million acres of forest and natural climate solutions in China, US, Colombia, and Kenya. In the same context, you can look at Unilever, which is a very, it's a consumer goods company. All of us buy products, whether it's soap, shampoos, or detergents from Unilever. They have in fact committed to a €1 billion fund called the Climate and Nature Fund over the next 10 years, which again will be put into restoration, reforestation, sequestration, and including wildlife protection and water preservation. So many of the initiatives that they have currently ongoing, like Ben & Jerry's sustainable dairy farms or 7th Generation looking at clean energy, will all get tied in. And interestingly, they talk at Unilever about offsets, which is like funding projects that are happening outside, but also insets. So looking at their own operations and where their own products come from and making that sustainable. So take, for example, that they buy a lot of agricultural products. Can they look at solutions like agroforestry that improve the operations of their own supply chain and are inset into the kind of outcomes that they want, both on climate and nature? Another example is P&G, again, a very similar commitment that they have made, and again, working with the big NGOs like Conservation International and WWF to look at how they might be very similarly looking at some of these solutions. The one thing that I do want to point out here is that as all of these companies are making these commitments, we also need to parallelly have some kind of supply to meet this demand, and it will come down to a number of the organizations, such as the NUS Climate Center for Nature-Based Solutions, or these NGOs or local organizations, to create that kind of programs on the ground that look at reforestation, restoration, protection, because protection is the easiest, the most cost-efficient way. And Madhu talked about intact forests, of keeping that carbon in the ground without losing it. So we really need to start with a protection agenda. And how do we curate these and bring these to market, so to say, for companies to invest? And so what you're looking at, therefore, is sorry, it's not moving forward. Is looking at huge investments that are being brought into this. So exactly like we were talking about the context of, can we go back one? I'm seeing it's not moving for me. We're looking at big financial investors coming on stream. So we have HSBC and Pollination Asset Management really looking at bringing almost like $6 billion of investment into protection of nature and giving a return back on that. So again, looking at the same thing of protection, preservation, conservation, restoration, and sustainable use, but large amounts of money being put forward by these by actual mainstream stream investors. And then you start looking at saying, what's the supply side going to be like? And on the next slide, we have one example from South Pole, which is curating these programs again with sorry, let me see if I can move this. Looking at a project that you can see on your screen, really the biodiversity hotspots and critical ecosystems that we need to protect. So here you have just 6 examples, but there are many more, whether it's a forest or it's a restoration of degraded land, or it's looking at soil and grasslands. How do you bring these together? How do you curate these? How do you create these? And how do we make sure that the funding goes into the programs that have the most impact? So this is where a lot of the excitement is happening right now in terms of ensuring that we can match the demand and the supply to get the outcomes that we want. And you can't do it alone. So you also have big UN agencies like the UN Environment Program that is now creating a platform. So they're bringing a lot of these companies and in line with the governments, because we don't have the right policies and we're not going to be able to make these investments and we don't know how to count it. And there's a number of issues. So being brought together by the UN Environment Program to create a leaders group, to create a leaders pledge, to give good examples that are out there to facilitate how these companies and investments can be brought to bear. And so I just wanted to also end with saying that it's not all good. We have to have very credible criteria on what counts and how these projects are done. It has to be part of a decarbonization strategy. So we can't just say, oh, you can keep emitting as much as you want or keep using as much fossil fuel as you want, and we can just offset all of that by natural solutions. We have to reduce as much of our emissions and be as efficient as possible. And then whatever does get left behind, we need to mitigate through nature-based solutions. It's not just going to take over and allow us to keep emitting endlessly. We have to put nature first. One of the biggest things we need to talk about is that it needs to be net positive results and resilience for nature, not just financial returns. So it's not just about making an investment and seeing what financial return you get. There has to be a natural nature and biodiversity benefit to it. It has to be transformative. This is very important because we can get into consequences where you might have a net reduction in CO2 emissions, but you might actually have a negative impact on nature. So for example, just reforesting grasslands is not the way to go, because grasslands are actually very strong sinks of carbon. So replacing it with plantation forests is not a good solution. So we need to be looking at ecosystem services that go beyond climate, like water, like wildlife, like clean air. And last but not least, it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse to have a business model and sell carbon emitting products going forward. So let me just end there and take any questions, and thank you for your time. Madhu, back to you.
Thank you very much, Kavita. That's fantastic. We will now be taking some questions from the floor. Please submit your questions at the link provided on the screen. Right. Okay, so let me start off, just one second. So I'm going to first start with questions that link to the presentations that have been made. So let me start with the one, if you can just scroll down a little bit to the third question. Yes. So Dr. Go mentioned that the replacement of natural areas with artificial gardens can lead to a decrease in biodiversity, such that rarer species become. What are the implications of this on climate change and carbon emissions in Singapore? Dr. Go, are you able to address that?
Yes, so when habitats are removed, like when secondary forests are removed, carbon is released because most of that carbon is locked in the tree trunks and is in the soil. And when you remove them and you build buildings on them, that carbon is permanently lost. And with that loss of carbon, there is also the loss in biodiversity when one destroys a forest. And even if you plant back some plants as nature ways or rooftop gardens, you will not get the full complement of biodiversity as you will find in the forest.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the next question to both of you, Kavita, and to Dr. Go, and you can decide. Maybe we start with Kavita, and then Dr. Go can also add. Singapore's carbon and biodiversity footprint, as we've seen, can be quite. I mean, especially beyond Singapore, could be very significant. So, what steps do you think Singapore can take to ensure that its energy, food, and ports don't undermine regional, global efforts to utilize nature-based solutions to address climate change? Maybe we start with Kavita and then.
Thanks, Madhu. Really interesting question. And I think this is as true for countries as it is for companies, because the footprint that we have currently in our consumption models are very global. And I'll just take one example of food. I mean, Singapore has a 30% by 2030 target to be self-sufficient, but currently it's very low. And all of our food in Singapore is being imported in from around the world. And some of these products have an immense impact on biodiversity globally. You take something like sustainable seafood or sustainable palm oil, or even looking at coffee and soy. All of these products that we take for granted come from landscapes which are currently under threat due to expansion of the food production and plantations such as these crops, maybe as far as Brazil or as close as Indonesia and Malaysia. So what we do with our demand from Singapore and how we look at our impact on climate needs to be really global. And in that context, it's not just about looking at our biodiversity within Singapore, which is obviously absolutely critical, but also looking at the impact that we have globally and making investments and trying to offset the impact that we have. And so investing in nature-based solutions within, say, Southeast Asia or Asia or even globally to offset some of that impact that we have through our demand, through our value chains is very, very important. And of course, the first step of that is to demand that the production of the products that we buy, for example, palm oil, which creates all the fires and the haze in our neighboring countries, is sustainable, and to be willing to pay, even if it's a slight premium for those products, to ensure that the communities get a benefit, but that we have ecosystem services ensured and biodiversity ensured, and that then has a net climate impact. So we are looking at a very global system around our food and our energy and all the products that we consume, and we need to be cognizant of that as Singaporeans as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kavita. Dr. Go, did you want to add to that?
I think Kavita mostly said all the points I wanted to say, but also I think individual choices, decisions also make a difference. So, going to the supermarket, you buy cooking oil that has the RSPO symbol, or you buy sustainably fished seafood. I think these are all really important, and individual efforts would add up into a global effort, country effort also. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. One question that has come up is relating to financial institutions. So what are some ways that financial institutions can bridge the current gap between having the right intention, example, announcing ESG initiatives and actually taking action to drive change with their assets? I suppose that goes to Kavita.
So you're right. I mean, there is a growing interest from the financial sector in terms of ensuring that the investments that the financial sector make through their ESG, which is environment, social, government criteria that they are putting together. And so some of the examples that we are looking at right now, I talked about one from HSBC and Pollination, where they're setting up a very significant fund in terms of such nature-based solutions and how you get there. But on the other hand, very directly, and I'll go back to the sustainable commodities work that we were talking about in terms of palm oil or soybeans, we are now seeing investors and I'll take an example from Brazil around soybeans, and beef, which is one of the biggest reasons why you're seeing deforestation in the Amazon, which is the lungs of the world. The companies that produce that beef or the soybean, the food companies, are being pressured by a coalition of financial institutions saying that they will not invest in those companies unless those companies have very clear deforestation targets and can show that they are meeting them. So you're seeing an immense pressure coming from the financial sector in that context. We are even seeing companies like, whether it's HSBC or Standard Chartered or some of the others, even in Asia, now having very clear guidelines in terms of not just ranking them, but where their investment goes. Even big institutions like BlackRock are stepping up. So we are seeing a shift, and you have examples of green bonds and many of the other things, but it's still fairly small in the big scheme of things. And I think we need to ramp that up so that it's core to how financial sector operate versus being these special instruments. But we're definitely seeing a big shift, and even in government funding. So, the Norway fund of $1 billion going into reducing deforestation in Indonesia is significant, again, based on action and results, not just a simple funding. So long way to go, but we are seeing some big shifts in that in the financial market.
Thank you, Kavita. I think we are slowly reaching the final few minutes. The question, how does the Center for Nature Climate Solutions influence policy making in Singapore? Who are the co-sponsors of research? So I think it's very early days. I suppose it's just started this year. If Lian Pin Ko is on the call, I would invite him to answer that question. Lian Pin, are you here? He's not. But yes, I mean, I'm afraid we don't have all the information on this. I'm sure we can get back to you on this, on the details of the for this question. Shall we move on to another question, please? So, right. Okay. So that's a good one. What are the main barriers for scientists to inform governments about importance of biodiversity, especially when it comes to urbanization? Dr. Ko, would you have any insights on this for Singapore?
For Singapore, I think most of the time the government has made up its mind about what it wants to build on where already, even before consulting people, consulting scientists. And I think I would say that is the main barrier. But we are starting to see a change in recent years. There is starting to be more consultative processes, and the government agencies are starting to engage NGOs and people even before they finalize plans to develop certain places. So I can only answer for Singapore context. I'm not sure how it would be for the other Southeast Asian countries.
Right. Did you have any, thank you for that. Did you have any advice on how we can communicate the need for nature-based solutions to a layperson? And how do we make our scientific knowledge meaningful?
I think as a layperson, for anybody actually, the way we learn things is through what we learn from young, the systems that we grew up with and that we know very well. And I would sort of broaden that question and ask if we could manage our systems and we could do things, or we could have policies that are more inclusive. So you have like multidisciplinary way of approaching problems and not just being, so I think most of us have grown up in it's silos. So we would look at biology as one subject, geography as one subject, economics as one subject. And I think that there can be a lot more integration between these subjects to tackle these problems. Then we can talk about communicating these solutions to the layman.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I believe we have come to the end of the session. There are a lot of interesting questions, and maybe we can try to answer them separately, but I think we'll have to bring the session to a close. Thank you all for participating, and thank you to Dr. Go, Ms. Prakash Mani, and to everyone who joined us today. Special thanks to Zhang Ji and Yulin for excellent organization and coordination. They are the behind the scenes wizards of this webinar. Before we end, let's all take a group photo. And if you're comfortable, please, can you turn your videos on for a quick photo? Great, thanks everyone.